If you could travel back 20,000 years and stand on the exact spot where you are sitting right now, you would not recognize it. Not because the buildings are missing, because the shape of the continents, the level of the ocean, the weather above your head, and the animals walking beside you would all be different. Britain was not an island. You could have walked from Siberia to Alaska without ever getting your feet wet. The Sahara Desert was a green, living landscape with rivers, lakes, and hippos. And above your head, instead of clear blue sky, there might have been ash-gray clouds drifting in from a volcano that erupted 1,000 miles away. This is not a different planet. This is Earth. Just a version of it that almost none of us have ever been taught to picture correctly. Stick around, because by the end of this video, the map in your head of what this planet used to look like is going to be completely rebuilt. And we are going to explain exactly how scientists know all of this, without a single photograph, without a single written record. If you enjoy journeys into the deep, forgotten corners of human history, this is exactly the kind of thing we dig into every week on this channel. So consider subscribing before we go any further back in time. To understand what Earth looked like to ancient humans, we have to go back to a very specific moment. Roughly 20,000 years ago, our planet was at the peak of what scientists call the last glacial maximum. This was the coldest, iciest point of the most recent ice age. Nearly a third of all the land on Earth was buried under ice. In North America, a single ice sheet called the Laurentide ice sheet stretched from the Arctic all the way down to what is now New York City. In some places, that ice was 3 to 4 kilometers thick. That is taller than most mountains you have ever seen, made entirely of frozen water. In Europe, another massive ice sheet covered Scandinavia, much of the British Isles, and reached into northern Germany. If you had stood at the edge of that ice sheet, you would have felt a wind so cold and so constant that it reshaped the land itself, grinding down rock and carving valleys that still exist today. Here is the part that changes everything else on this list. All of that ice had to come from somewhere. It came from the ocean. Water evaporated from the seas, fell as snow, and became locked away in these enormous ice sheets instead of flowing back to the ocean. And when you lock away that much water, sea levels around the entire planet drop. Scientists estimate that global sea level during this period was about 120 meters lower than it is today. 120 meters does not sound like a dramatic number until you realize what it actually does. It redraws the map of the entire world. Because sea level was so much lower, huge areas that are underwater today were completely dry land back then. And this changes the entire story of how humans moved across the planet. Take the Bering Strait, the narrow stretch of ocean that separates Siberia from Alaska today. During the Ice Age, that strait did not exist. In its place was a vast landmass scientists call Beringia, in some places hundreds of kilometers wide. This was not a thin, precarious bridge. It was a full landscape, with its own tundra, its own grasses, and its own herds of animals. This is the route most researchers believe the ancestors of indigenous peoples of the Americas used to walk into a new continent, following herds of game rather than crossing open water. Now travel to Southeast Asia. The shallow seas between the islands of Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Southeast Asian mainland were, for long stretches of the Ice Age, dry land as well. Geologists call this lost landmass Sundaland, and at its largest, it was roughly twice the size of modern India. Entire river systems ran across what is now open ocean, and human groups lived, hunted, and traveled across land that a scuba diver would need equipment to visit today. And closer to home for a lot of viewers watching this, look at the United Kingdom. Britain was not an island for most of human prehistory. It was physically connected to mainland Europe through a region now called Doggerland, a landscape of rivers, marshes, and low hills that today lies entirely beneath the North Sea. Fishing trawlers working in that part of the sea have actually dragged up ancient tools, mammoth bones, and even human remains from the seafloor, evidence of a lost world that people once walked across on foot. Think about that for a second. Places where submarines and container ships pass through today were once places where prehistoric families set up camp, built fires, and raised children. Here is something that might surprise you even more than the missing coastlines. Most of what is now northern Europe and Siberia was not covered in the dense pine forests you would recognize today. Instead, it was dominated by a completely different kind of ecosystem, one that no longer exists anywhere on Earth. Scientists call it the Mammoth Steppe. Picture a cold, dry grassland, stretching almost without interruption from Spain, across Europe and Siberia, all the way to Canada. It is considered the largest single terrestrial biome that has ever existed in the history of our planet. Larger than the Amazon rainforest, larger than the Sahara. And it supported an almost unbelievable density of large animals. Woolly mammoths moved across it in herds. Woolly rhinoceroses grazed alongside them. Cave lions, larger and more powerful than modern African lions, hunted through the grass. Herds of wild horses, reindeer, and giant steppe bison covered distances that would put modern wildlife migrations to shame. Ancient humans were not visitors observing this world from a safe distance. They were part of it. They were both predators and prey, competing with cave lions and hyenas for the same herds, using stone-tipped spears against animals many times their size. Archaeological sites across this region are filled with mammoth bones used to build shelters, because in a landscape with very few trees, a mammoth skeleton could become the frame of a home. Not every part of the ancient world was locked in cold. The story of the Sahara Desert is maybe the strangest chapter of all. For long stretches of prehistory, in a period scientists refer to as the African humid period, the Sahara was not a desert at all. It was a green, living landscape, filled with lakes, rivers, grasslands, and yes, hippos. Rock art discovered deep in the middle of the modern Sahara, in places that have not seen meaningful rainfall in thousands of years, shows people swimming, herding cattle, and hunting crocodiles. Try to sit with that image for a moment. People were hunting crocodiles in the middle of what is now one of the driest, most inhospitable places on Earth. Earth's climate during this era was not a straight, stable line the way we often imagine it. It swung dramatically between wet and dry periods, and these swings forced human groups to move, adapt, and sometimes abandon entire regions within a handful of generations. Climate, in other words, was not background scenery for ancient humans. It was one of the main characters in their story, actively deciding where they could live and where they could not. At this point, you might be asking a very fair question. Nobody was taking photographs 20,000 years ago. So how can scientists possibly be this specific about mountains of ice, lost land masses, and long-vanished grasslands? The answer is that Earth itself kept its own kind of diary, and researchers have spent decades learning how to read it. Ice cores drilled out of Antarctica and Greenland contain tiny bubbles of ancient air, trapped and preserved for hundreds of thousands of years. By analyzing the chemistry inside those bubbles, scientists can reconstruct past temperatures and carbon dioxide levels almost year by year, Fossilized pollen, buried in layers at the bottom of ancient lakes, tells researchers exactly which plants were growing in a given place at a given time. Sediment cores pulled from the ocean floor preserve a record of sea level, temperature, and even the chemical fingerprints of ancient rainfall. Fossilized bones, combined with breakthroughs in ancient DNA analysis, let scientists identify which species lived where, how they were related to each other, and when they disappeared. Put all of these pieces together, the ice, the pollen, the sediment, the bones, and the DNA, and you get something remarkable. You get a detailed, cross-checked map of a planet that no human has seen with their own eyes in over 10,000 years. This is not guesswork. This is one of the most rigorously tested reconstructions in all of science, built by combining fields as different as glaciology, geology, botany, and genetics. So what happened to this ice-bound, grassland-covered, land-bridge-connected version of Earth? Starting around 15,000 years ago and accelerating around 11,000 years ago, the planet began warming rapidly, bringing the Ice Age to an end. The enormous ice sheets that had locked away so much of the world's water began to melt, releasing trillions of tons of water back into the oceans. In some regions, researchers estimate sea levels rose several meters within a single century, fast enough that people alive at the time could have noticed the coastline creeping closer within their own lifetimes. Beringia sank beneath the waves, cutting off the land route between Siberia and Alaska. Sundaland flooded, leaving behind the scattered islands of modern Indonesia. Doggerland disappeared entirely, turning Britain into the island it is today. And the Mammoth Steppe itself began to fracture and shrink, as warmer, wetter conditions replaced dry grassland with forest and wetland across huge stretches of its former range. This ecological collapse is closely linked to the extinction of the very animals that had defined that world for tens of thousands of years. The woolly mammoths, the woolly rhinoceroses, and the giant steppe bison among them. Many researchers consider this one of the most dramatic climate transformations ever documented in the archaeological and geological record. And unlike the changes happening on our planet today, this one was not caused by human activity. It was something ancient humans had to live through, adapt to, and in many cases, be displaced by. Beringia, Sundaland, and Doggerland are the most famous examples, but they were far from the only lost landscapes on Ice Age Earth. Look south of Sundaland, toward Australia and New Guinea. During the Ice Age, these two landmasses, along with Tasmania, were fused into a single supercontinent researchers call Sahul. To reach Sahul at all, ancient humans still had to cross open water, since even at the lowest sea levels, a deep channel separated Sundaland from Sahul. This means that some of the earliest known sea crossings in human history happened tens of thousands of years before anyone had access to metal tools, written language, or anything we would recognize as a formal boat-building tradition. Whatever vessels they used have long since rotted away, but the fact that people successfully reached Sahul is undeniable proof that Ice Age humans were far more capable than the phrase primitive tends to suggest. Now travel north to modern-day Japan and Korea. For much of the Ice Age, lower sea levels connected the Japanese archipelago to the Asian mainland through a combination of land bridges and much narrower straits than exist today. This allowed animals, and eventually people, to move between the continent and what are now isolated islands. When the ice melted and the water rose, those connections were severed, leaving behind island populations that developed in relative isolation for thousands of years afterward. Even the Mediterranean Sea looked different. Sea levels were lower, Coastlines extended further out, and some islands that are separate today, like Corsica and Sardinia, may have been joined into a single larger landmass or separated by a much narrower stretch of water. Some researchers have also pointed to catastrophic flooding events, such as the possible rapid filling of the Black Sea roughly 7,000 years ago, as the kind of dramatic, community-altering event that could have lodged itself in oral tradition for generations. Though this particular theory remains actively debated among geologists and archaeologists. The pattern repeats itself again and again across the Ice Age world. Wherever you look, the coastlines were different, the land was more extensive, and entire regions that are now defined by open water were once solid ground that people called home. It is easy to talk about ice sheets and land bridges as abstract facts on a map. So let's slow down for a moment and think about what daily life actually felt like inside this world. Winters on the Mammoth Steppe were brutally cold, with temperatures capable of dropping far below anything most of us have ever experienced, and daylight hours in the far north could shrink to just a few hours a day. Shelter was not optional. It was the difference between life and death, which is exactly why archaeologists find so many dwellings built from mammoth bone and covered with hide, cleverly engineered to trap warmth in a landscape with almost no wood to burn. Fire was not just for cooking. It was constant, guarded, and passed down like a precious resource. Since starting a new one from scratch in freezing, wet conditions was neither quick nor guaranteed. Food came from tracking enormous migratory herds across huge distances, which meant that many Ice Age human groups were not settled in one place for long. They moved with the seasons and with the animals, carrying tools, children, and stored food across landscapes that could stretch for hundreds of kilometers between reliable water sources. In the Green Sahara, life looked completely different, closer in some ways to the lakeside and riverside communities we associate with early agriculture, with fishing, hippo hunting, and cattle herding forming the backbone of daily survival. The sheer diversity of these lifestyles, from Arctic-adjacent mammoth hunters to Saharan lake dwellers, all existing on the same planet at overlapping points in time, is a reminder that there was never one single caveman experience. There were dozens of radically different ways of living, shaped entirely by the wildly different version of Earth each group happened to call home. Before we close out this journey, it is worth clearing up a few misconceptions that even documentaries sometimes get wrong. The phrase Ice Age makes it sound like the entire planet was frozen solid at the same time, but that was never true. While glaciers buried the north, regions closer to the equator experienced their own dramatic shifts between wet and dry conditions, as we saw with the Green Sahara. The climate of this era was a patchwork, not a single uniform freeze, and different human groups on different continents were dealing with completely different challenges at the very same moment in history. Another common myth is that Ice Age humans were technologically stagnant, doing the same things generation after generation without change. The archaeological record tells a very different story. Toolkits became more specialized over time. Sewing needles appear in the fossil record, suggesting tailored clothing rather than simple draped hides. And long-distance trade networks moved materials like seashells and obsidian hundreds of kilometers from their original source. The sea crossing to Sahul alone is evidence of planning, cooperation, and transmitted knowledge passed between generations, none of which fits the outdated stereotype of a purely reactive, instinct-driven species. It is also worth remembering that these were not separate, isolated bands living in total ignorance of each other. Genetic evidence increasingly shows contact, mixing, and even interbreeding between different human populations, including with other hominin species like Neanderthals and Denisovans, across many of the very landscapes this video has described. The Ice Age world was not empty, and it was not simple. It was crowded with different peoples, different pressures, and different solutions to the same basic problem of staying alive on a planet that refused to hold still. Here is what makes this whole story genuinely remarkable. It is not just that Earth used to look this different. It is that human beings, armed with nothing but stone tools, without maps, without writing, without any of the technology we take for granted, still found ways to survive, adapt, and migrate across a planet that was rewriting itself beneath their feet, generation after generation. The world they knew is gone. The ice sheets melted, the land bridges sank, the Mammoth Steppe disappeared, and the green Sahara dried into sand. But their footprints have not entirely vanished. They remain in our DNA, in the caves they once sheltered inside, and in the rock art they left behind on walls that, until recently, we had no way of properly reading. Every one of us alive today is, in some sense, a living continuation of the people who crossed Beringia, who hunted across the Mammoth Steppe, who rafted their way onto the shores of Sahel, and who swam in the lakes of a Sahara that no longer exists. None of those journeys were guaranteed to succeed, and countless groups almost certainly vanished along the way, leaving no trace for us to find at all. The ones whose descendants survived to tell the story, in a sense, are all of us. Watching this video on a screen that would be unimaginable to the very people whose survival made it possible. Every mountain range, every coastline, every grassland you have ever visited has its own hidden version of this story. A shape it used to hold before ice, water, and time rearranged it into the world you know now. The earth beneath your feet has never actually been still. It has only ever been patient, changing so slowly that entire human lifetimes pass without anyone noticing the shift. And somewhere, right now, the landscape around you is quietly becoming the next version of this same endless story. The next time you look at a map, remember that you are looking at nothing more than a single frozen frame in a film that has been running for billions of years, and that the ancient humans who once stood on that same ground were living through one of the wildest scenes this planet has ever produced. If this journey into a vanished version of our own planet was interesting to you, this is exactly the kind of story we tell every week on this channel. Subscribe, tap the notification bell, and join us next time as we trace the footprints of another world that time has erased.